Today we're going to be learning Taanit Daf Kafchet. Today's daf is sponsored by Sharon Ra'anan in loving memory of Menachem Yitzchak ben Shaul and Susan Bat Rachel. And today's daf is also sponsored by Karen Kasowski in loving memory of her mother Elaine Ackerman, Esther Masha Bat Aharon. She always loved learning and would have loved to be a part of the Hadron community. Okay, we're going to get started right now from the top of our daf Kafchet. I'll remind everybody to please sign up for the Siyum. There's Siyums happening, number one, on Zoom. The main Siyum will be on Zoom in English on Sunday at 8:30 Israel time. The Siyum also, there'll be Siyums around the country in Israel, all different places, and there'll specifically be a Siyum in Renana in English. For those interested, I'll also be teaching in Jerusalem. Rabbanit Chamutal Shaval is teaching in Modi'in. I'll be teaching actually with Rabbanit Karen Kirschenbaum in Jerusalem, and there's other great shiurim going on in other places. I'm not going to list them all. And also, I'll be teaching in Renana in English on Monday morning if anyone is around or wants to join. So all of the registration for the English Siyum is on the English side. And if you want to register for one of the Siyums in Israel, go to the Hebrew side of the site. It's a little flag icon. You can just switch from English to Hebrew easily. And right at the top of the homepage is the registration. Okay, we are going to get started, and we're all excited that Megillah is starting on Tuesday. That's also very nice. It's a little bit ahead of Purim, but not too far ahead, so it's good preparation. Okay, here goes our and another month-long Masechet, as we're getting used to. Okay, Parasha Gedola Korin ota b'shnayim, b'shacharit u'b'musaf u'b'mincha korin al pihen. So now we're keep going back to different parts of that very long Mishnah. If you have a large section, you split it into two. If you remember, we read this line in the Mishnah, we said there's a problem because there's no punctuation in this line. So we don't know how to read it. So if you have a big section, you split it into two. We already did that yesterday. B'shacharit u'b'musaf u'b'mincha korin al pihen. Now comes the big challenge. Where do you put the period? Does that mean that you read the Torah b'shacharit and musaf, period, and then at mincha, you read it al peh, the way you read Shema, which means you don't actually read from a Torah. You just recite the section in the Torah about the creation of the world, but you recite it by heart. Remember, in those days, people knew things much better by heart because they didn't have books to rely on, so they had to rely on their memories. Right now, our memories aren't so good anymore because everything is, right? I think about when I was a kid, I used to remember everybody's phone numbers. Now I can't remember anybody's phone numbers because you don't need to anymore. So why waste memory space? So, or do you read it as b'shacharit? You read it from the Torah, and b'musaf u'b'mincha you read it b'al peh. Musaf and mincha you don't read from the Torah. So that's the Gemara's question. A question was asked. Hechi kamar, how do you read this? B'shacharit u'b'musaf korin ota b'sefer. Shacharit and musaf you read it from a book. U'b'mincha korin ota al peh. Or mincha you read it by heart. Kekorin Shema, oh, like the way you read Shema, oh, Dilma, or maybe Hachi Katani. This is what the Mishnah means to say. B'shacharit korin ota b'sefer, period, and shacharit only. U'b'musaf u'mincha korin ota al peh kekorin Shema. So how are we going to resolve this? Tashma. Tashma means, we'll repeat this every time, often when we see it. Tashma means come and learn, literally. And what it means is, let's bring a source from somewhere else for the purposes of whatever purpose we needed in the Gemara, right? As opposed to a word which is very clear, this is coming as a question or this is coming as an answer. Tashma, we don't really know, number one, what type of source they're bringing. It could be Taanit, it could be from the time of the Amoraim. We also don't know for what purpose they're bringing it, and for that, you need to look at the context. So now we're going to see both that it's a Taanitic source because it's introduced with the words Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, and number two, we know they're bringing it as an answer because they just asked a question. So the response is, let's see from this source. The main thing that you know is that instead of bringing, let's say, so-and-so says, they bring a source that was quoted somewhere else, and they bring it in here. And they basically say, oh, we're going to pull some source from somewhere else and use it for our purposes. Ditanya b'shacharit u'b'musaf nechnesim lebeit hakneset. V'korin shederech shekorin kol hashana. There you have it. Shacharit and mincha. You do it by reading from the Torah. And in mincha time, an individual reads it, recites it by heart. Okay, and the assumption is, we're going to see from the continuation, that they assume some individual gets up, the way we read from the Torah, but instead of reading from the Torah, they say it by heart. Remember, in our day, we would basically say they read it from a chumash. right? They don't open from the Sefer Torah, they read it from a Chumash. Okay, again, what are we talking about? Because I think I'm quickly reading. There isn't different Torah reading for Shacharit and Musaf. Okay, the idea here, what we're talking about here, just so I be clear, the Ma'amadot were these extra, right? There were people who came to pray extra on that day. And they would, besides praying, they actually had their own prayers. They also would have a Torah reading, which was the Breshit. We're talking about the same Torah reading. Apparently, they would say it multiple times during the day. So twice a day, they read it from a Torah, right? It's hard for us to understand because we don't have such a thing. Twice a day, they read it from the Torah. And another time, they would read it like they read Shema. Becky, I see you're saying that you're not really allowed to read the Torah by heart. Maybe that's why, I don't know, but maybe that's why they say, Ki korin et Shema. In other words, they want to give you some sort of model, since we don't normally do this. But Shema, for example, we say by heart. Again, by heart for us really means from a siddur. But they didn't have siddurim. So when they say by heart, it's basically the same as we're saying. Just means without a Sefer Torah. So they're giving an example here of a case where we do allow it. So they'd say here as well, it's allowed. But we're talking again about the same reading, right? They're going to do it multiple times a day. Again, it's strange for us to understand because we don't ever have a Kriyat Torah. If we do have Kriyat Torah and Shacharit and Mincha, it's always a different Kriyat. Here, the idea is the same. So then, we already have an answer to our question. Okay, our question was Shacharit and Musaf versus Mincha. Mincha Yachid Korei Ota Al Peh. But now Rabbi Yossi is going to take issue with this Mincha and reading it Al Peh. Amar Rabbi Yossi, V'chi Yachid Yachol Likrot Divrei Torah Al Peh B'tzibur. Can I get up in shul as if I'm a chazan and read from the Torah by heart and try to fulfill the obligation of everybody to hear the Torah reading? We don't have such a thing. I don't know what you're talking about. Ela kulan nechnesim v'korin ota al peh kekorin et shema. He says, no, it's not that an individual read it on behalf of the community ba'al peh, by heart. No. Every individual themselves were in the shul. Whoever was part of the ma'amad would be in shul, and they would recite it by heart. Almost now, it's really like the way you read Shema, which is everybody on their own reads the Shema, and says it by heart. So that's just the side issue that came up in this Braita that we were quoting. But it's interesting, even though it wasn't the part of the flow of the Gemara, which is really just trying to get to an answer. Where do you put the period in the sentence? And the answer is you put the period after Musaf. But in addition, you learn that everyone did it. It reminds me a little bit of when we had the shofar blowing, and then it said everybody then took out the shofar and blew it themselves, that there's some idea about the certain parts of the prayer that everybody does themselves versus parts of the prayer that someone would fulfill the obligation on behalf of others. And I assume they didn't take out the Torah just because to do it so many times is a burden and time consuming and all that. Kol yom sheyesh bo halel ein bo ma'amad. So now what you really need for this is the continuation. And I'll already tell you the next line has many different interpretations because the Gemara asks, Ma hefresh ben zeh lezeh. It doesn't really tell you what zeh is and zeh is. So there are different interpretations. I'll go with one of them. So if we look back at the Mishnah, and I brought it on the sheet so you can look at the sheet, it says there that Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai have a machloket. When it comes to halal, everyone agrees if there's halal that day, there's no ma'amad in shacharit, which makes perfect sense because halal is in the morning. So we don't say the ma'amadot, the tefillot of the ma'amadot or the kriyat Torah and shacharit because we don't have time because we fill it with halal instead. On a day where there's a korban musaf and they're busy with things about musaf, so Rabbi Akiva said ein b'ne'ilah, and Ben Azai said ein b'mincha. Okay, there's a machloket. In the end, Rabbi Akiva concedes to Ben Azai in the Mishnah, if you remember. And we're going to understand soon, okay, we don't understand it yet, but that when it says ein b'ne'ilah, it means when there's a korban musaf, there's no ma'amad in musaf, mincha, and ne'ilah. And when it says ein b'mincha, it means just musaf and mincha. Okay, it's not so clear yet from the Mishnah, but we'll see that soon that that's the meaning. When there's korban itzim, Rabbi Akiva says ein b'mincha, and Ben Azai says ein b'ne'ilah. Okay, so if it's your turn to bring the korban itzim, and you're in the ma'amad, or maybe even any ma'amad on a day where somebody brought a korban itzim, we already said there were two different explanations. Either you don't say the ma'amad in mincha, or you don't say the ma'amad in ne'ilah. So now the question, my fresh ben zeh lezeh, I'm going to go with one of the interpretations. What's the difference between musaf and itzim? Okay, and we're going to go with Ben Azai, because he's the one who the Mishnah is explained like him in the end, because even Rabbi Kiva concedes to him that my fresh ben zelazeh. Why on a day when there's musaf do we not say it in mincha, and on a day when there's korban etzim we don't say the ma'amad in ne'ilah? So the answer is halalu divrei Torah, halalu divrei sofrim. Musaf is by Torah law, right? To bring the extra korbanot, and now when we don't have korbanot, we say the psukim. That, right? We say a prayer. So that is by Torah law, and therefore it's going to override the ma'amad of mincha, which is by Torah law. But when it's a day that it's Rabbanan, which is only the korban etzim was a minhag, so therefore we're going to have it override ne'ilah, which is a Rabbanan tefillah, right? We have the tefillah keneged avot tiknum, right? We have shachrit, mincha, and arvit, and then we add musaf, really, but there's nothing about ne'ilah there. Ne'ilah is this additional prayer, which is a later development. Okay. Again, there's a little bit of a difficulty with that explanation, which is why there's a bunch of different explanations, but I'm not going to get into that so much. Okay, I see someone's asking, what's a ma'amad? Let me make it very clear what the ma'amad is. Ma'amad means really two things when we're talking about it, and maybe that's why it's a little confusing. Number one, the ma'amadot were people who came to the temple or to their local synagogues to pray that the korbanot be accepted. When we say then there's no ma'amad, what we mean is the prayers that they would say, and as they would pray, apparently, right? They would pray 4 times that day. Shacharit, mincha, musaf, if there's musaf, mincha, and ni'ilah. Okay? So they would pray these 4 prayers, and each prayer they had some sort of prayer that they would say, and they would read from the Torah. So that's what we mean when we say Ema Amad. It means they don't say those prayers at that time of day because they're busy with other things. And by the way, some people said that this was only referring to the Ma'amadot that were in Jerusalem, because the ones that are in their own cities, they're not busy with the sacrifices at all. They have time to say all these other things. But the ones that were in Jerusalem apparently were backup support. They would bring the wood if it was needed. They would, bring water if they needed. They would bring whatever was necessary. They were kind of errand boys that week in the temple to do things that needed help. So therefore, when there was, it seemed, certain days there were extra things to do, and therefore they didn't have as much time to do all the prayers of the day. That's the general concept. Okay, next. Zman atzei kohanim v'ha'am. So we already discussed this, but now we're going to see it inside, which is what were these days of the wood sacrifices? What are we talking about? And what's the history? Tanu Rabbanit. Lama hutzruchu lomar zman atzei kohanim v'ha'am. Why did the Mishnah talk about these zman atzei kohanim v'ha'am? There were 9 days a year, and what were these days? Amru k'shalu b'nei al-gola lo matzu etzim b'lishka. Okay, and we're going to quote a pasuk from Nehemiah, which really talks about this. When they went up from the exile and they went to Israel, to the new temple, they didn't have enough wood for all the sacrifices that needed to be brought. So individuals came and donated from their own wood stock. And then when the Nevi'im saw them do this, so what exactly are Nevi'im? They weren't really Nevi'im, but they must mean, right, Ezra and Nehemiah. When they saw this, even if we now in the future have tons of wood, they said, these families that began as donating, they're going to donate every year, right? It's funny. It's like people make donations to organizations and they do it on a yearly basis, right? It's like that. This is your donation. So you're going to do this every year. Shenema, how do we know this? We're going to see a verse that talks about this. Okay, and the goralot that they had on the korban etzim, I guess, who brings when? HaKohanim v'Leviim b'ha'am, right? The Kohanim who brought the Leviim and the nation, which is the language in our Mishnah, except they cut out Leviim. L'havi lebeit Elokeinu lebeit avotenu le'itim mizumanim shana b'shana, at distinct times every year. There you have it, that this was something instituted for the long term. And yes, I see people writing, it was like a gift to these people. In other words, it was saying, right, to a certain extent, sometimes, you're asked to donate is kind of annoying. You have to, it's almost like unfair. Why me? Why do I have to do this every time? What about everybody else? On the other hand, it's an honor to be able to bring the wood to the temple. That's a huge honor. People were excited about it. It was a special status that they achieved by saying, oh, you're going to be the ones now who bring it. You get the zchuyot, the merits of doing this because you did it the first time. So now you get to do it the next time. Just continuing now in the verse. Right? And you're going to bring these every year. So to burn on the altar every day, on a daily basis, as it says in the Torah. Okay, so now we're jumping to a different section, which is in that section. Okay, they're already jumping ahead. In that section in the Mishnah, it listed who brings on what day. Then we get to one day, which was the Chamisha Asar on the 15th of Av, which we already talked about at the end of the Mishnah, had unique significance for other reasons. We'll get back to that at the end of the Masechet. Who brought Bnei Zaytu ben Yehuda, v'imahem, and with them, not only the Bnei Zaytu, but also Kohanim u'Leviim, the Chol Mishata, right, also Kohanim and Leviim, and Kol Mishata b'Shivto. Any Kohanim and Leviim or people who were part of a family and knew they had a tradition of being part of one of these families, but they didn't remember which family, so they would bring on this default date of the 15th of Av. And in addition, the Bnei Gonvei Eli, those who were, well, I called it as robbers, but they were, I would say, deceitful with this pestle. We'll talk about it soon. And the Bnei Kotzei Ksiot, those who pressed figs, we'll see who those people are. All these people brought on the 15th of Av. So now the Gemara is going to say, Tanu Rabbanan, what we want to know is, right, we're going to bring a braita that tells us who these Bnei Gonvei Eli were and Kotzei Ksiot. It sounds very weird. Mahayu Bnei Gonvei Eli u'Bnei Kotzei Ksiot. Amru, so they tell the story. Pam achat gazra ha'malchut gezerah al Yisrael shelo yaviu etzim lama'aracha v'shelo yaviu bikurim liYerushalayim. There was a time when the authorities forbade them. The foreign authorities said you are not allowed to bring etzim for the altar, and you're not allowed to bring the first fruits to Jerusalem on the holiday of Shavuot. And not only did they say you can't do this, but classic, hoshivu prosdaot al adrachim kederech shoshiv Yeravam ben Nevat. Interesting, they're making a connection to Yeravam, but first let's explain what they did. They set up a roadblock, and they basically checked everybody going into Jerusalem to make sure they weren't bringing any of these items. Okay, now, it was just like Yeravam ben Nevat. Remember what Yeravam ben Nevat does? He's the one when the Malchut splits between Yehuda and Yisrael in the time of the son of Shlomo, Rechavam. The Malchut splits. The Beit HaMikdash is in the domain of Yehuda, also Binyamin, but basically, it's in the charge of the Malchut Yehuda. And Yeravam says you are not to go on the holiday, and puts up roadblocks to prevent the people from Israel getting to the temple on the holiday. And he makes his own holiday a month later. Anyway, we're not going to discuss that whole thing there. But he was definitely not a person who right, he also puts up the two calves in Beit El and Dan, the two golden calves. Anyway, we're not going to get into all the details of Yeravam, but he's definitely known as not the most, right, he's the person who Hichtiak Israel, he caused the Jews to sin. He was definitely a very bad king. We'll get back to him at the very end, but we don't have so much to say about him right here. In other words, they're just saying basically these people were trying to prevent the Jews from getting to the temple to do their thing. The good people in that generation and the people who feared God, what did they do? They brought their bikurim anyway. They put figs all around, and they carried them into, right, they basically hid them underneath figs. And they carried them to the temple. We'll see in a minute why they did this. And they brought the pestle on their shoulders. They said, where are you going? They said, listen, we have to get to the other side because our mortar is there, the mortar and pestle, right? They need them both. Said, look, here's my pestle on my shoulder. Here are my figs. I'm going to just press them over there, right? I need to take care of that there. So they let them in, right? And as soon as they passed through the border, what did they do? So they got through the border. It sounds like the border wasn't exactly an entrance to Jerusalem. Then they basically decorated their baskets, brought them into Yerushalayim the way they normally brought the bikurim. So they just had to get through that roadblock, and then they were fine. Tana. Now, there's another Braita that tells a very similar story. B'nei Salmai Hanetofati. These are the sons of Salmai Hanetofati. Who's Salmai Hanetofati? Tanu Rabbanan Mahem B'nei Salmai Hanetofati. Who were they? Amru, very similar story. This time it's just the wood for the burning on the altar. Same exact thing. They put people roadblocks, just like Yeravam did. And what did those God-fearing people do? Now you know why they were called salmai, from the lashon of sulamot, which is a ladder. They took the wood that they needed. They built with it a ladder. And they put them on their shoulders and they went. Now you'll remember the beginning of Beitzah, if you learned it. They had all these questions about, can you move the ladder from all the dovecotes from one to the other? So what did they say? They said, where are you going? We're going to bring, right? We need to get the birds over there. We need ladders to get to the dovecotes from one to the other. So, that's where we're going. And as soon as they passed the roadblock, Perkum, they took them apart, and then they brought them to Jerusalem. Here's an interesting ending to the section, and this is going to sound very familiar if you remember Masechet Yoma and Masechet Shkalim. It's actually a Mishnah in Yoma that was quoted in Shkalim. So what does it mean? Right? On these people are considered Zecher Tzaddik Livracha. They're considered the tzaddikim in this world, as opposed to, I told you, we get back to Yeravam ben Nevat, right? These people basically were sacrificed their lives to get to the temple and worship in the temple. Yeravam to the opposite, and therefore he's called Shem Hashem Yerkav. The name of Rishaim should rot, because he was preventing people from getting to the temple to worship God on the holidays, especially. Anyway, why is this like Yom? Do you remember? We had a list of all these people who worked in the temple. Again, what's interesting is temple related. There was a list of people, and there were some of them who were Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, and there were some who Shem Hashem Yerkav. Remember, we had the story of the Beit Avtina's family and the other family that hid their secrets, right? They knew how to make the Torah, and they knew how to do the Lachem Apanim, and they didn't tell anyone. And there was a debate. Are they on the side of the good guys or the bad guys? Was it good that they kept their secret, or was it not good? But that was the context where we had this before. Okay, Be'esrimbo. Now we're continuing on the list. B'nei Pechat Moav ben Yehuda. It's a very strange word. Pechat usually is some sort of leader, and Moav is Moav, which is a Moabite nation. It's not Jewish. So what are we talking about here? So there's a machloket. Tana b'nei Pechat Moav ben Yehuda. Hem b'nei David ben Yehuda. These are the sons of David. They're descended from David. David was from Ruth HaMoaviyah. So he was called Pechat Moav. It's basically a reference to David. That's Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Hein b'nei Yoav ben Tzruya. Yoav ben Tzruya. Tzruya was the sister of David, and Yoav was his nephew. It's from Yoav because she was also descended from Ruth HaMoaviyah, same family, and therefore when it says Pechat Moav, they don't mean David, they mean Yoav. Okay, yeah, right. He was the Sar Tzava, if you remember. He was the head of the army. Be'esrim be'elul b'nei Adim ben Yehuda. Now there's another family, Adim ben Yehuda. So again, same machloket, but you'll notice that instead of Rabbi Meir, it's Rabbi Yehuda who says the first opinion. Tanu Rabbanan b'nei Adim ben Yehuda, Hein b'nei David ben Yehuda, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda identifies these people with the b'nei David, not the Pechat Moav, but these people. And Rabbi Yossi Omer, Hein b'nei Yoav ben Tzruya. He says these are Yoav ben Tzruya. Okay, so he basically says, according to the way we're going to understand the Gemara right now, he thinks both Pechat Moav and Bnei Adim are both Yoav ben Tzruya. And when it comes to Rabbi Meir, he thinks the first ones are Bnei David, and Rabbi Yehuda thinks the second ones. So comes the Gemara and they say, wait a minute. The Mishnah doesn't seem to fit with any of these three opinions. Why? We'll see right now. The Mishnah continues and says, if you look at the sheet for today, you'll see the list of all the families again. Okay, and there it says that Parosh was in the beginning. They were, I think, the second date. And then you have Parosh was the third day, Chamisha B'Av. And then in Achab B'Tevet, the very last day, we need to have a double. Shavu B'nei Parosh Shniya. They went a second time, which seems to imply what? Nobody else went twice. Now, this doesn't work because if you look at the list, who's second on the list? Esrim B'Tammuz are B'nei David ben Yehuda. So according to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, B'nei David appear twice, either on the 20th of Av or on the 20th of Elul, depending on whether it's Pechat is David or Adin is David, okay? So you're going to have a repetition. So that's what we're going to read right now. So mani matnitin. Who is our Mishnah go according to? Lo Rabbi Meir, v'lo Rabbi Yehuda, v'lo Rabbi Yossi. Why? Rabbi Meir, litnei shavu b'nei David ben Yehuda shniya. It should have said, just like it said b'nei Paro shniya, when it said b'nei Pechat Moab ben David, ben Yehuda, it should have said shniya because it's the second time they did it. Because b'nei David already did it. They were the second group. Rabbi Yehuda, litnei shavu b'nei David ben Yehuda shniya. When, according to Rabbi Yehuda, when it says b'nei Adin ben Yehuda, it should have said there shenit. They did it twice now. So it doesn't make any sense. What about Rabbi Yossi? Because B'nai Yoav ben Tzruya didn't appear before, so it shouldn't be a problem. But what did Rabbi Yossi say? Both Pechat Moav and B'nai Adin are both the sons of Yoav ben Tzruya. So in those two, right, in the second one there, B'nai Adin, it should have said Shniya, because they just gave right before and they gave a second time. So Rabbi Yossi, Litni Shavu B'nai Yoav ben Tzruya Shniya. And it doesn't say Shniya there. So what do they answer? La'olam Rabbi Yossi, utrei t'nai libed Rabbi Yossi. It really is Rabbi Yossi, but what do we have here? We have a machloket in each braita, right? One said that Rabbi Yossi said B'nei Pechat Moav, Pechat Moav. Yes, B'nei Pechat Moav ben Yehuda is Yoav. And in the other braita, it said B'nei Adin is Yoav according to Rabbi Yossi. It was two different opinions about what Rabbi Yossi actually held. Rabbi Yossi didn't hold, at least according to the way the Gemara understands it, didn't hold both are Yoav. One of them is we just don't know which one. So then there's no repetition, and the only repeat is Parosh, and that would make sense. And then our Mishnah has to follow Rabbi Yossi. Next, if you remember, on the first of Tevet, it was a unique day of the year. Why was it unique? Because it had Hallel, because it's Hanukkah. It had Musaf, because it's Rosh Chodesh. And it had, people brought Eitzim that day, so it had that. So there's no Ma'amad, because you don't have in Shacharit. And then because of the others, you don't have in Musaf, Mincha, Ne'ilah, right? That covers all your bases, although we're going to see. Okay, like I said, the Mishnah just says, one no Mincha, one no Ne'ilah. Theoretically, maybe you would have thought they do it in Musaf, but we'll see in a minute that nobody thinks you do it in Musaf. So Amarle Mar Kashisha Bereid Rav Chisda the Rav Ashi. Mar Kashisha, the son of Rav Chisda, says to Rav Ashi the following question. He assumes, or the question, the way Rav Ashi understands this question, they assume that, again, going back to either Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Yossi, one of those things, right? The fact that there's Musaf means there's nothing in Ne'ilah, let's say, and the fact that there's Korban Eitzim means there's no Ma'amad in Mincha, or the reverse, right? Depending which opinion. But nobody talks about Musaf at all. So Ma'ishna Halel de Dachi Didei, Ma'ishna Musaf de Lo Dachi Didei. Why, when there's a day when there's Halel, which we say in the morning in Shacharit, there's no Ma'amad in Shacharit, meaning it makes sense, right? Just like we said, since they're busy in Shacharit, so therefore there's no Ma'amad in Shacharit. So why on Musaf it doesn't push off its own, meaning on a day when there's Musaf, there is a Ma'amad in Musaf, because it doesn't say anywhere there isn't a Ma'amad in Musaf. So Amarle Rav Ashi, what are you talking about? If you're going to say when there's Musaf, there's no Mincha or there's no Ne'ilah, which isn't even time-wise connected, of course there's not going to be a Ma'amad in Musaf. And that's why I said before, the way everyone reads the Mishnah is when it says there's none in Ne'ilah, what it means is there's none in Musaf, Mincha, and Ne'ilah. And when it says there's no Mincha, it means there's none in Musaf and Mincha. Okay? So now they say, Amarle, Hachi ka'aminalach. So he says, no, this is what I meant to say to you. Lo lidche ela didei. What I meant to ask you was, why doesn't it only push off the Ma'amad of Musaf? Just like Hallel, which is said in the morning, only pushes off the Ma'amad of Shacharit. There is no Ma'amad in Shacharit, but there is the rest of the day. Why wouldn't you say on a day when there's Musaf and they're busy with Musaf, There's no ma'amad in musaf, but the rest of the day there should be. And that's clearly not either of the opinions that we saw. To which, it's a very good question, right? It doesn't really make sense. Why? It doesn't keep them busy the entire day. So what does he answer? Amar le, Ika Rabbi Yossi dekai kavateh. Okay, this is what we say when someone has a good question, right? A good answer is to say, oh, actually, it's true. Not everybody holds that way, but there is someone who holds just like you. And now we have to prove that Rabbi Yossi holds like him. So we're going to bring a statement of Rabbi Yossi in a Braita, who seems to be, according to the commentaries, responding to Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Okay, the original Rabbi Akiva before Rabbi Akiva ends up conceding to Rabbi Yossi. Okay, so let's go back to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva held Korban Musaf ein b'ni'ilah and Korban Itzim ein b'mincha. Okay, to which Rabbi Yossi responds, Titania, Rabbi Yossi omer, Kol yom sheyesh bo Musaf, yesh bo ma'amad. On a day when there's Musaf, which Rabbi Akiva said there's no ni'ilah, which we assume means what? There's no Musaf, Mincha, and Ni'ilah, right? There's no ma'amad in any of those. So he says any day when there's Musaf, which means even a day like the first of Tevet, where there's no Musaf, no, right? There's Musaf, there's Halal, and there's Korban Itzim. And then let's just go through. If there's Halal, there's no Shacharit. If there's Musaf, there's no ma'amad and Musaf, Mincha, and Ni'ilah, basically until now, or at least Musaf and Mincha. So he says, any day when there's Musaf, there is a ma'amad, okay? There is a ma'amad. We don't know exactly what this means. So now, ma'amad demai. Again, what we want to prove is what? That the only thing that Musaf overrides is Musaf itself. Okay, so now let's see. Ma'amad demai. If he wants to say there is a ma'amad in shacharit, again, this means any day where there's musaf, which means even a day where there's also korban itzim and also halal. So let's talk basically a chabetevet. So would there be a ma'amad in shacharit? And he's trying to say there is a ma'amad in shacharit. So ha-tanakama nami hachi-kama. So, actually right now that I think about it, no, it's not yet. 1 second. Right here, they're actually talking if it's just musaf, okay? Let's forget about if there's halal. Let's just talk about a day where there's musaf. Yesh bo ma'amad, you're not going to, if ma'amad of shacharit, even Tanakama thinks there's a ma'amad in shacharit. In other words, that's not an issue. Rabbi Yossi is trying to say something unique. If it's musaf, everyone knows musaf only overrides things from musaf and on, okay? So therefore, no one thinks that there's no ma'amad in shacharit. And therefore, that can't be something that's unique that Rabbi Yossi is saying against Rabbi Akiva. Ela ma'amad de musaf. Let's say he's saying when there's musaf, there's also, you do say the ma'amad in musaf. That can't be either because didei nami lo dachi, right? As a question, didei nami lo dachi, it's not going to override. Of course it overrides musaf. We already just explained that before. For sure, they're not going to have time if there's a korban musaf to say musaf. Ela de mincha korban itzim dachi. Now we're going to go to when there's an overlap. In other words, if it says kol yom sheyesh bo, it means even on a day where there's korban itzim. Now, so if you want to say it has, you would say mincha. Well, korban itzim would override mincha because that's what Rabbi Akiva said. Korban itzim is doche mincha, and korban musaf is doche ne'ilah. So ein bo ma'amad of ne'ilah. Therefore, elalav de ne'ilah, it must be. Right, Rabbi Akiva, we're assuming that Rabbi Yossi doesn't disagree with the korban eitzim, and that once there's korban eitzim, so that overrides mincha. So what are we left with? When he says yesh bo ma'amad, what he wants to say is every day where there's musaf, there will be a ma'amad in ne'ilah, and that means basically that he thinks that korban eitzim is doche mincha. Right, if you have halal, it'll be doche shachrit, and if you have musaf, it'll be doche musaf. Because if you have a day where all three, so there's not going to be shacharit because of the halal, there's not going to be musaf because of musaf, there's not going to be mincha because of the eitzim, but there will be ne'ilah. So what do you see here? That musaf itself only overrides, when he says yesh bo ma'amad, what he wants to say is musaf itself only overrides musaf. It's a little bit complicated, but that's what he wants to say, that it only, yesh bo ma'amad means it has a ma'amad in ne'ilah, okay, that it won't override ne'ilah. Okay, that's the main thing. And then What it really is saying then that Musaf is only Dochan Musaf, because each other one is basically overridden by something else. So that's his answer. Shmamina dide dache delav dide lo dache shmamina. So your whole question of saying, why isn't Musaf only overriding Musaf? Why is it overriding other things? Well, Rabbi Yossi thinks like you do. Okay, again, it wasn't 100% clear that that's what Rabbi Yossi holds, but that's what Rav Ashi understands Rabbi Yossi's opinion as saying. Now we have another question. We said Chag B'Tevet is the only day that has all three. But comes the Gemara, and you're going to wonder why they asked this question, because you already know the answer, but because we already explained it. The Litni Nami Chag B'Nisan lo haya bo ma'amad mipnei sheyesh bo halel v'korban musaf v'korban etzim. Right? Chag B'Nisan has Halel because it's Rosh Chodesh. It has Korban Musaf because it's Rosh Chodesh, and it has Korban Etzim because it's a day that there were people who brought on the first day of Nisan. So Amarava Zot Omeret Halel Deberesh Yachelav Deoraita. This proves that Halel on Rosh Chodesh is not Deoraita, and that's why it's not considered Yom Sheyesh Bo Halel. Yom Sheyesh Bo Halel is only where by law. Okay, I want to not exactly say Deoraita by Torah law, because we're going to see the Hanukkah is here, and Hanukkah clearly isn't Torah law. You have to say Halal, because Hanukkah didn't exist in the Torah, but we mean by law, okay, as opposed to by custom. So now, how do we know this? There's 18 days a year where the individual has to say the entire, completes the Hallel. There's different explanations of what that means, whether you say it with the bracha, you say the whole thing. What are these days? Eluhen Shmonat Yimei Chag, right? The 8 days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret. Shmonat Yimei Chanukah, the 8 days of Chanukah. Yom Tov Arishon Shel Pesach, only the first day of Pesach. Yom Tov Shel Atzeret and the Shavuot. Ubagola in Chutz La'aretz Esrim ve'echad Yom. They have to add 3 days. Eluhen Tishat Yimei Chag, right? Simchat Torah. Shmona Yemei Chanukah. On Chanukah, we don't add any extra days. And Shnei Yamim, that's because it's Rabbanit only. And Shnei Yamim Arishonim Shel Pesach, the first 2 days of Pesach, because the second day might be the first day. And Shnei Yamim Tovim Shel Atzeret, and there's 2 days of Shavuot. So on those extra 3 days, we have to add. Rav Ikla leBavel. Rav gets to Bavel. Remember, Rav was living in Israel, and then he goes and establishes the first yeshiva in Bavel. When he comes to Bavel, right, so as when you go to a new place, you see different customs. Chazinu dekakaru halel b'reish yarcha. You see them saying halal on Rosh Chodesh. Savral afsakiru. Right, you come into a shul, you see them doing something. What are you doing? He wanted to stop them and say, you can't say halal on Rosh Chodesh. But then, kevan dechazed, luckily he kept his mouth shut for a few minutes and just kind of watched. Right, it's a good lesson to learn. Kevan dechazed dekamedalge diluge amal shmamina min hagavatem b'yedehem. Then he saw that they skipped some of the paragraphs, and he realized this must just be a custom. And that's why we skip paragraphs in Hallel, right? We call it Chatzi Hallel, because we want to show we're not doing this by law, we're doing this by custom. Tana, there's a braita that says, Yachid lo yatchil v'im yatchil gomer. An individual shouldn't start Hallel, but if he did start, then he finishes. Okay, what exactly this means? A bit of a debate whether you shouldn't say the whole thing, whether you shouldn't say it with a bracha, whether you shouldn't say it at all as an individual, and they only say it in the shul. Sfaradim have it, I believe, that only the Shliach Tzibur says the bracha, and the community doesn't say the bracha on Hallel Rosh Chodesh, and that comes from a possible explanation here. Okay, now moving on to the last section for today, which is the 5 things that happen. And now we're going to get to the different dates, and then tomorrow we'll get to Tisha B'Av and the different dates of Tisha B'Av. Nishtabru haluchot minalan. Okay, I see someone's asking why we don't say all of Hallel on all the days of, why we don't say Hallel on all the days of Pesach, right? We do say Hallel, we just don't say the whole Hallel. So there's explanation. One of the main explanations given is because of the 7th day, Maseh Yadai Tovim Bayam V'atem Umrim Hallel, right? God had to kill all the Egyptians at Kriyat Yam Suf, and it's not appropriate that we should be saying Hallel. And then if we're not going to say it on Yantif, then we shouldn't say it on Chol HaMoed. It seems weird. So because of that, that's one of the main reasons given. Okay. Anyway, we'll get back to that when we have more. Like this sugya was an aside about Hallel. We'll talk about it more. I believe the whole thing comes up in Megillah. Maybe not. I don't know. We'll get there at other times. Okay. Now we're going to get to the dates of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, all the things that happened. Nishtabru haluchot minalan. How do we know the luchot were broken on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz? Here the chronology is pretty easy. On the 6th of Sivan, the luchot were given. Rabbi Yossi Omer v'Shiva Abo. There's a debate, was Shavuot on the 6th, or was it on the 7th of Sivan? But either which way, okay, they got the Aseret HaDibrot, and then Moshe goes up on the mountain to get the actual tablets. So first, right, God comes down, appears on the mountain, and then Moshe goes up 40 days, gets Lucha, brings them down, and breaks them. So the one who says it was on the 6th he went up, they got the Lucha, they got the Torah, the Aseret HaDibrot, then he goes up the next day. Umanda Amal b'Shiva nitnu b'Shiva ala Moshe. Right? The question is, how busy a day did Moshe have? Did he go up on the same day that they got the Aseret HaDibrot? But either way, he definitely went up to the mountain on the 7th day. Dichtiv, as it says, Moshe bayom hashvi'i. It says God called to Moshe on the 7th day, and then it says Vayavo Moshe b'toch ha'anan. Right, and then Moshe goes up in the cloud. Vayal elahal v'hi Moshe bahar ba'im yom v'arba'im laila. So then he goes up into the mountain, and he goes there for 40 days and 40 nights. So let's do the count. Esrim v'arba'a de Sivan. So if you count day number 7 through day number 30, that gets you 24 days. V'shitzar de Tammuz, and 16 of Tammuz, that's 40. Malaluhu arba'in, you've gotten to 40. B'shifsar b'Tammuz nachi, comes down the following day. He was there for 40 full days and 40 nights. Then he comes down the mountain on the 17th, and then atav tavrinu lelucho. Right, and then he breaks the luchot uchtiv. It says there, vayika sher karav lamachaneh vayaret ha'egel. He sees the golden calf. Vayashlech miyadav et haluchot. He throws the luchot from his hands or drops them. But right, it sounds like he throws them. Vayishaber otam tachat ahar, and he breaks the luchot. So now, so that's how we get to the 17th of Tammuz. Batel tamid. How do we know the tamid sacrifice was nullified? Gemara, it's a tradition. Okay, there's a big debate about whether this happened in the time of Bayit Rishon or in the time of Bayit Sheni. Was it Xera that they wouldn't let us do it? Was it that if we talked about that story, that there was a siege on the city and they kept asking them for animals, and then one day they gave them pigs, and because of that, they said, we're not doing this anymore. So was it kind of instituted by the people, or was it instituted by the foreign authorities, whatever they were, whether it was Bayit Rishon or Bayit Sheni, it's not so clear. Wait, was it on the 17th that the city that the walls were breached? Right, they did a siege on the city before, and then the walls broke down on the 17th. But wait, it says in Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, it says on the 4th month and the 9th of the month, the famine got very serious. And then it says it says the city fell. Right, the walls fell of the city. Sounds like it happened on the 9th. So the answer given here, Amarava lo kasha kam b'rishona kam b'shniya. First temple, second temple. The first temple was the 9th, second temple was the 17th. However, in the Yerushalmi, because you might be thinking, wait, didn't I grow up thinking that Yud Zayin B'Tammuz was the first temple? So the Yerushalmi actually says that there was a mistake in the calculation of the days, and that Yirmiyahu was actually like that was a mistake or something. There's some sort of explanation there that it really was the first temple. Okay, next. And how do we know this? He bases it on a braita, Rava Detanya b'Rishona of Kaha'il, b'Tisha b'Tammuz, b'Shniya b'Shiva Asar bo. And there's this braita that proves it was really second temple. And that the first temple, it was on the 9th. And then they just had to choose one date, so they chose the 17th. Luckily for us, since we ended up with this custom of the 3 weeks, right, it would have been 4 weeks. Okay, Sarafa postimosat Torah Gemara. That's a tradition that he burnt the Torah. We have a tradition that this happened. Hamid Selim behechal minal, and some people think, right, that it's Apostomus who put it Selim at the same time. Some people think that it was talking about in the time of Menashe, when there was in the king of Yehuda, which was much earlier, right? This is talking about second temple, and that's first temple. Again, there's lack of clarity here. So anyway, Hamid Selim behechal minal, and how do we know this? Diktiv, and they quote a pasuk from Daniel. Okay, from the time they took the tamid out, they ended up putting this idol in. So it sounds like when there was no more korban tamid, there was a tzelem that was put in, which again, when you think batela tamid, that would affect whether this is Bayit Rishon or Bayit Sheni, right? First temple, second temple. And now the Gemara asks, wait a minute, Hamid tzelem be'echal is singular, one tzelem. There was only one. Another verse from Daniel says, there was on the wings of the shikutzim, which is plural of the idols. So there were idols there. So Amarava, there were 2 idols. This sounds like the story of Abraham and the idols. There were 2 idols. One fell down on the other and broke its hand. The and it was said about this, and it was found on, it's unclear now, on one of the idols, which idol, the broken one and the non-broken one, What this means exactly, also a subject of debate among the commentaries. An savet lecharuve beite, you wanted to destroy my house, God, right? It's like God saying, Yadcha ashlimat le. I will give you a hand. Now, either I will help you, some people say, or I will cut off your hand. And that's why the broken idol was broken, saying, oh, here's a sign I'm trying to break you. I'm going to destroy you because you're trying to destroy my house. Okay, with that, we will end for today. And like I said, we'll pick up tomorrow, or which will be up later today, about the Tisha B'Av and the different dates of Tisha B'Av and how we get to that the 5 things happen there. They're also going to see contradictory psukim and psukim that don't always line up exactly with the dates that we said, and we'll have to figure that out. Okay, have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Meet up on Sunday. And remember, Sunday, just to review, Sunday, we're having the Siyum, but the daf, it's really on Monday, the Siyum. So on Sunday, you'll learn Sunday's daf before the Siyum, and then on Monday morning, on Sunday afternoon, evening, morning, wherever it is by you, at the Siyum, we'll learn the last daf. Okay, so basically make sure to do daf lamed before you come to the Siyum. Okay, have a great day.